a troubled youth went into confession and began by telling the priest, "Before we get started, I should tell you I don't believe in God." The priest responded, "Oh, it's okay, I don't believe in God either," which of course upset the kid, and it was not what he expected to hear, and so he said, what do you mean you don't believe in God?" And the priest responded, "I don't believe in the God that you don't believe in." By the same token, I'm often confronted with people who say they don't believe in astrology, and my response is, I don't either. Because chances are, if you don't believe in astrology, then I don't believe in the astrology that you don't believe in. What is astrology? It comes from the words astro, logos. Logos as in the beginning of the Bible. In the beginning there was logos, which was poorly translated into word. Logos is not just speaking of a word. Logos is the synthesis of idea and word. In a way, it's the logic of the universe, and astrologos is the synthesis of metaphysics and physics. It's how the metaphysical becomes physical. Astrology, simply stated, is a study in correlation that planetary patterns have causal relationships to events here on Earth. As the ancients said, as above, so is below. The within is like the without of things. Astrology claims that we as living organisms on planet Earth are affected by and part of a larger cosmic fabric. We can see that in the framework of our lives if we look at it accordingly. For example, we move through the seasons astrologically. The Earth moves around the sun according to a logos, according to a logic of astrology. In a way, it has been said that astronomy, nomi naming, astro-naming is about naming of things up there, the giving of the names and definitions of stars and various celestial objects. Astrology, however, is about the meaning that is attached to those very same objects. It's been said that astronomy is a glove and astrology is the living hand inside the glove. From a scientific point of view, it's all happening pretty darn fast. Just a few generations ago, we lived in a world where things were things. What you saw is what you got. Newton's world consisted of gravity that made objects collide, pulled flying objects toward each other. It was the law of how things moved in the real world. But as we developed technology to expand our perceptions, we began to develop tools that allowed us to see infra, lower than, and ultra, higher than, frequencies that we could previously perceive. It was Buckminster Fuller who said that 99% of all science in the 20th century was happening in areas of universe that were invisible to our five senses. Does that make it less real? Telescopes gave way to radio telescopes as our sensory perceptions were moved into other bands of electromagnetic frequency. Microscopes gave way to electron scanning microscopes that allowed us to see objects or things that were so tiny that if we looked at them with optics, the size of a photon would hit them and bounce off it and therefore change the course of its action. In a way, our journey into the subatomic realm that began in the late 19th century changed everything, because scientists discovered that these subatomic particles were not particles. They looked like particles when they were measured, but they traveled, they propagated like waves. And so scientists came up with a bizarre series of theories that we lump together and call quantum theory or quantum mechanics, that include theories of indeterminacy. The more we know about where an electron is, the less we know about where it's going. The more we know about something's mass, the less we know about its trajectory. We can't know both. We can know electron as particle or as wave. The more we know about it as particle, the less we know about it as wave. Quantum physics, according to its inventor, Niels Bohr, is not stranger than we think. It's stranger than we can think. Quantum theory has changed everything, because what was a mechanical external universe has now become a web of intelligence. In this environment, astrology makes sense. In this environment of communication, of information that is not just about seeing things, all of a sudden astrology again fits into the scientific paradigm. You see, our sense organs perceive everything as vibration. If we hear something, we're hearing frequencies. When we hear a note like A below middle C, we're hearing 440 cycles per second. An octave higher is twice that frequency, or 880 cycles per second. When we see something like the color red or the color green, we're seeing a particular frequency of electromagnetic radiation. And it turns out that the visible spectrum is a very narrow slit in a very large, perhaps infinitely large band of frequency vibration. What we see as visible light, Newton showed came from invisible white light. And through a prism, we saw that invisible light become red, orange, yellow, blue, green, indigo, violet. However, we've now learned that higher frequency than violet, ultraviolet, can be seen by some animals. Bees, for example, with their eyes can see ultraviolet. Snakes, with their eyes, and some other reptiles, can see infra to red or infrared. They see heat. We feel infrared as heat. But in fact, lower frequency than infrared takes us through a band of waves that include radio waves, short waves, that include power wave distribution, 60 cycles per second that come through our power outlets in this country, or 50 cycles a second in Europe. Higher frequency than violet, ultraviolet, includes waves that are so fast that go up to gamma radiation, that are so high frequency that they pass right through Earth without even noticing that there's something solid there. It's my contention that planet waves are not separate from the electromagnetic spectrum. Science has become real good at instrumenting electromagnetic radiation, but only in high enough frequencies where they can get repetitive signals. You see, the problem with instrumenting perception of a Saturn wave is that instead of happening in gigahertz or megahertz or kilohertz, it's happening only 3 cycles per century. So how do we get a device that will tell us, that can hear a Saturn wave, if we only get 1 beat every 29 and a half years? It becomes an interesting dilemma from a scientific point of view. And yet, if you look at planets, we see up there, we see objects in space. We see blocks of rock, mass, lumps. But are planets particles or are planets waves? Is light a particle or is light a wave? At the microcosm, quantum physics has us believing that microscopic subatomic particles are both at once particles and waves. It's the particle-wave duality. At the macroscopic level, planets in their own macro-quantum universe are both particles and wave. We look up there and we see Saturn in the night sky, or we see the moon in the night sky. But the fact is that the moon is also a wave. It's a wave of 13 beats or 13 cycles per year. And that 13 cycles per year is not any different than a cycle of hundreds or hundreds of thousands of cycles per second. The difference is that we can't hear it and we can't see it. We can only watch it unfold in time. And now we come full circle, because astrology is the study of these waves. It's the study of planet waves, introducing not just a 3-dimensional reality of the real world as we see it, but it introduces a 4th dimension, and that 4th dimension is time. And of course, Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared, shows clearly that mass and light are tied up as one. That mass becomes light, becomes mass, becomes light in an endless dance. And in fact, it is through time, but time is tied up to the speed of light, because as we approach the speed of light, time becomes infinitely slow. Time stops at the speed of light. And so here there becomes this kind of paradox of time and space all being mixed in, and we look at astrology as a way of understanding how what we perceive in this moment as now is actually just one piece of an ongoing unfolding of planetary cycles, and we can actually use the mapping techniques of astrology, which we astrologers call a horoscope. Just like a telescope allows us to scope to see tele far away. A microscope allows us to scope to see something micro, tiny. A horoscope allows us to see the hour. The word horo is just Greek for hour. So that astrologers have a technology that allow us to unfold the understanding of this moment with respect to a larger perception of time. Whether we do it in an individual's life, an individual who is born, gets sick, gets healthy, becomes of age, has a girlfriend or a boyfriend, suffers loss of love, suffers the death of a parent, has a great job, has their own family, becomes married, has a family, grows older, and all these events seem to correlate in our lives to the same invisible hands on these cosmic clocks that we astrologers observe by watching the planets go around and around and around. As an astrologer, I am a pattern seeker. I look for correlations between larger rhythms and smaller patterns. I look for correlations between events up there and events down here, and I find them. Matter of fact, many astrologers throughout the ages have found these very same patterns. Astrologers have been employed by kings and queens and popes and religions throughout all humanity in order to get a sense of what's going on. Even Christianity, which says in the Lord's Prayer, "It is done on earth as it is in heaven," is simply reflecting that fact, that there is a connection between events down here and events up there. When I look at the planets, I don't see planets with names. I see a rich mythology of symbol. I see symbols that have meaning, that have been attached to them by humans in many cultures throughout time. Interestingly, the symbols take on similar meanings in cultures that are very far apart, that had no apparent communication with each other from times distant past. For example, in Sanskrit, the ancient Vedic astrologers called Jupiter Guru, the teacher. In the West, the Roman or Latin word is Jupiter or Jove, for the Greek word Zeus. All of these images, however, carry with them a picture of beneficence, of greatness, of largesse, of teaching, of ideas, of opinions. The symbolism is consistent throughout time and throughout different cultures. Every planet has a mythology and symbolism attached to it. For example, Mars is the god of war. We astrologers look to the planet Mars and its rhythms to understand how we may defend our territory, or how we aggress, or how our ego takes on individual situations. We watch Mars heat up as the planet heats up in various phases of war. We look at the rhythms of planets relating to each other. The sun, the moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. To an astrologer, these are hands on a cosmic clock. We look at the clock on the wall, and when the two hands are in the same place, we know that's the beginning of an hour. When two planets are in the same place, that's the beginning of their cycle. For example, when the sun and the moon are lined up, this is a new moon, and it happens once a month, or once a month, because our calendar is astrological. Every planetary pair has a rhythm of new moon, like the beginning of an hour on the clock, or full moon, like half past the hour. This rhythm is repeated on a monthly basis by the sol-lunar angle, or by the sol-lunar rhythm. The sun and the moon create a measurement in time that is the month, but we on Earth look at patterns and we divide them in half and in half again. This is how we measure things. So we divide a month in half and we get a fortnight. Although that's not a measurement in use much now, at one time it was as important a measurement as a month. We divide a fortnight in half and we get a week. So our calendar is astrological. When people say, do you believe in astrology? I tell them I don't believe in astrology any more than I would believe in chemistry or mathematics. It's something to know about. It's a tool to use when it can be applied sensibly. Every planetary pair, like the two hands on the clock, like the hour hand and the minute hand, have a cycle of repetition where they come together like a new moon, and when they oppose, like half past the hour, like a full moon. We can look at these slower rhythms and we can see the relationship between these planetary cycles and history. Astrology doesn't only affect individual humans on the planet. It doesn't only affect how I live my life. It doesn't only influence my rise and fall as a human being. It doesn't only affect the times in my life when things seem to work easier as opposed to times in my life when things seem to just be more difficult. We go through phases in our life, we all do, and these phases seem to correlate with these movements of the sun, moon, and the various planets. But so does the rise and fall of civilizations. Civilizations, just like individual humans, seem to be born in a time, live out a life, have a pattern, have different characteristics, and go through their process of old age and decay. And we can follow these rhythms just like we follow the patterns in an individual person's life. We can take, for example, a planetary pair. Let's start off with Saturn. Saturn is an interesting planet to begin with because it was the farthest planet from the sun to the ancients. Now, they didn't know that it was the farthest planet to the sun. What they knew about Saturn was that it had the slowest movement of all the planets. Of all the things that moved around in the sky at night, Saturn's movement was the slowest. Out past Saturn, slower than Saturn, there was nothing but stillness. The stars themselves did not appear to move. In fact, the word planet is just a Greek word for star that moves or wandering star. Saturn, to the ancients, was the end of the road. It was as far as movement could take us. Saturn is Latin for chronos, which is Greek. Chronos, chronometer, chronic, time. Saturn is Father Time. Saturn is what you get is what you deserve. In fact, Saturn is karma. Karma is Newton's third law. To every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction. It's very simply a planet of cause and effect, but it's long-term cause and effect. And so that as we live our life, as we get toward the end of the life, Saturn becomes the judgment of whether our life was worthy or not. Interestingly enough, when the Christians got a hold of the word Saturn, it etymologically became Satan. And Satan is Saturn, but with a negative spin, because if we're born of original sin, then we also, when we die, we find that we've made the deal with the devil, with Satan or Saturn, and it's not a pretty picture. In astrology, however, Saturn does not carry this negative judgment, but it does carry a judgment. And when Saturn, moving through the sky, aligns with a planet in our own individual birth chart, where a planet was on the day, time that we were born, when Saturn aligns with a planet in my chart, I feel it, I know it, I go through changes. So does everyone. In fact, I've been seeing clients for close to 30 years and have tens of thousands of cases of people whose individual lives have responded to the movement of the planets, and Saturn is perhaps the most obvious. Things have changed, and we now have moved from an age of things, an age of three-dimensional reality, into a different realm, into a realm of imagination. And in a little bit, we'll talk about why that has happened and the astrological ramifications of this great change. But I want to come back to Saturn, because Saturn is about things. Saturn is about real world. It's about what you see is what you get. It's about gravity. It's about those things which restrain us and hold us back and give us the structure within which to work and live. One of the structures that we work in and live in is the structure of the nation state, or religious structures, the structures of laws of the land. If we take a look at Saturn as one of these hands on the clock, Saturn goes around once every 30, let's say 30 years. It's a rounded number, but it's really 29 and a half years. We can take Saturn and map its 30-year cycle against a cycle of another planet, let's say Pluto. Pluto is the slowest moving planet that we know of today. Pluto is the planet that takes the longest to make one complete journey or revolution around the sun. It takes Pluto nearly 250 years to make one journey around the sun. In that same time, Saturn has made a little over 9 journeys, because it takes Saturn closer to 30 years. What this means is that in one Pluto trip around the sun, Saturn will line up with Pluto 9 times, approximately every 33 years, because Saturn goes around once in 30 years and then it catches up to Pluto. Saturn goes around in 30 years and it catches up to Pluto again. And so we have this Pluto-Saturn cycle, just like the high noon position of the 2 hands on our clock straight up. We have Saturn and Pluto aligning in their new moon position. We have Saturn and Pluto aligning once every 33 years. We can look at this cycle And we can look at the cycle with respect to the Saturn-Pluto alignment every 33 years, and then their opposition. That's the half past the hour, the halfway point in the cycle, just as a way of looking at a cycle. A cycle is a circle. A cycle is like the cycle of a tide. High tide, low tide. 12 noon, 12:30. 1 o'clock, 1:30. High tide, low tide. New moon, full moon. Saturn-Pluto conjunction, Saturn-Pluto opposition. If we look back throughout history at the Saturn-Pluto cycle and mark down the years in which Saturn-Pluto are in their high noon position or their half past the hour position, in other words, when they're aligned either on the same side of Earth or on opposite sides of the Earth, we can see the fabric of the unfolding of the clashes that go on and on and on through civilization. There's no limit to how deeply we could dig into this particular rhythm. But let's just talk about Rome for a moment, because Rome, the imperial city, did not have a foreign invasion for 1,100 years. In 410 A.D., the Visigoths came and burned Rome within a period of about a week. For 1,100 years, no foreigner had set foot into the city, and in a week it was all over. That was within 1 year of a Saturn-Pluto alignment. If we look back to 379, that was the previous alignment, and that was the year the Visigoths actually arose, put themselves on the map to, at the time of the following new moon cycle, at the time of the next alignment, that was when they took over Rome. We see this kind of repetition of historical patterns repeating themselves over and over again. When we learned history in school, we learned history using a timeline. We put the dates of all the historical events onto a line and we labeled them and we looked at the unfolding of history, bringing it right up to now. But as an astrologer, we look at the hands of the clocks going around and around and around. We look at the planets moving around in their repetitive cycles, and we see time not as a line, but as a continual interplay of waves, cycles within cycles within cycles. So let's look at history through the lens of astrology, through the lens of this Saturn-Pluto alignment, which happens every 16 years or so. It's in effect for about a year when they align on one side of the Earth, or with Earth in the middle on both sides, one on each side of the Earth. We can look, for example, at little events that don't make much sense unless we look at them in a huge historical context. Or we can look at large events that by themselves stand out as a tremendous ripple into the history of our culture or our planet. For example, at a Saturn-Pluto alignment in the year 532, Justinian, who was trying to recreate Rome, remember, Rome had fallen to the Visigoths in 410 A.D., and now a century later, Justinian, trying to recreate the dominion of Rome, put down a tax revolution. And in one afternoon, his imperial troops swept into an arena in Constantinople and killed 30,000 people in one afternoon. Now, we look at a cataclysmic event like the bombing of the World Trade Tower, the September 11th, 2001, when the United States was attacked by a group of terrorists using our own technology, using U.S. technology against this country in a demonstration that has somehow pulled the rug of safety out from under many of the people in our country. I'm going to create, by using the Saturn-Pluto rhythm, a wider perspective on this event that shouldn't take anything away from the importance of this event, but instead frame it as part of an ongoing, continual brush fire. And you say brush fire, well, 2 buildings were destroyed and several thousand people. Well, this isn't a comparative issue. We're not saying that this was more or less or better than or worse than. But remember, in 532 AD, 30,000 people were killed in one afternoon at this same cycle. But there are other events that feed into this clash between nation-states, between religious points of view, between metaphysical perceptions of the universe. In 629, for example, under a Saturn-Pluto alignment, Mohammed walked into Mecca and, without firing a shot, took over the city and declared the state of Islam. Islam was declared a nation-state or a city-state at a Saturn-Pluto alignment. A century later, in 711, Islam invaded Europe. Actually, the Moors came over the Iberian Peninsula and took over Spain. This was a major historical event, and they were there for 5 centuries. And it was in 1212, nearly 500 years later, in 1212, that within a 1-year period of time, Catholic Spain, in a series of battles, kicked the Arabs out of Spain and back into Africa. And sure enough, in 1212, there was a Saturn-Pluto alignment. It's like there's a cellular memory in history somehow that keeps these cycles alive, even if it's over periods of centuries, whereas we look at astrology often from the period of a human being, and we can see the patterns in an individual life. We're removing ourselves and looking at these patterns repeating throughout history. But it's not just these events. I mean, we can look at in the year 800, for example, Charlemagne was declared emperor by the Pope. And this ties to a sequence of Saturn-Pluto alignments that also tied to the year that Augustine arrived in England to convert the Saxons to Christianity. It also corresponds to Charlemagne defeating the Saxons. And again, we see these repetitive issues coming up over and over again at each alignment of the Saturn-Pluto. There's not a major historical event at every alignment of Saturn and Pluto. Sometimes it seems to lay dormant for 1 or 2 cycles, and then all of a sudden, like clockwork on the next cycle, something will happen. For example, other major historical events that correspond within a year of a Saturn-Pluto alignment include the Norman invasion of England, 1066, which was the year that determined England would be part of Europe rather than part of Scandinavia. This was very important for world history as we know it. In 1098, there was a Saturn-Pluto alignment, and in 1099, Jerusalem was reclaimed by the Christians after Arab control. This again was very important if we look at this in an ongoing history, especially in light of the events of September 11th, 2001. We see this ongoing clash between Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, and all these religious clashes that keep kind of coming up again and again and again. Remember, we had Islam founded in 629. We had Islam conquering Catholic Spain in 711. We had Catholic Spain reclaiming dominance in 1212. We have, for example, in 1518, within a year of Martin Luther announcing and posting the 95 Theses, which began the Protestant Reformation. This is a very big one. We have in 1212 an alignment of Saturn-Pluto, which corresponded with the Children's Crusade, in which 50,000 children were killed in an attempt to recapture the Holy Land again for Christianity from Islam or from the Arabs. In 1534, England separated from the Catholic Church, Saturn-Pluto alignment. In 1617, we had the beginning of the 30 Years' War, and 1648 was the end of the 30 Years' War. Both 1617 and 1648 were Saturn-Pluto alignments, and what was that war about? It was a war between Protestantism and Catholicism. Again, we have the same event that keeps coming back and back and back and back again. We even look more recently at the Saturn-Pluto alignment in 1786. Well, it was 1787 that the American Constitution was drafted. So we see the correspondence in major political events like that, bringing the Saturn-Pluto alignment closer to home, closer to the 21st century where we now live. Let's take a look at some of the recent alignments, because there's a very interesting theme, or several themes, that develop. 1834, Saturn-Pluto alignment. 1834 was a big year on several counts. Number one, it was the year that England outlawed slavery throughout the British Commonwealth. 1834, slavery abolished in the British Commonwealth. 1834, though, was also a big year for Spain. It was not a good year for Spain. And we see here a continual theme of colonial domination and then the kicking off of colonial domination. 1834 was the year that Simon Bolivar defeated the Spaniards in what was then called New Granada and is now Colombia, Ecuador, Guatemala, etc. 1834, Spain lost control in South America. 1834, the end of slavery in the British Empire. At the next alignment in 1850, we have the beginning of the slavery debate in the United States of America that culminated at the next Saturn-Pluto alignment in 1866. When the 13th Amendment was passed, slavery was outlawed in this country. And we have this ongoing theme now that again takes from 1834 to 1866, and there's three Saturn-Pluto alignments that define the definitive points in this cycle of the ending of slavery, not only of in England, but of in the United States of America, too. In 1883, England was involved in military action to create the Suez Canal, to protect the Suez Canal. So there was military action between the West, England, in the Middle East. Also, interestingly, within a year in 1834, a group of Europeans met in Europe to carve up Africa under European domination. At the following alignment in 1898, again, another bad year for Spain, because 1898 was the Spanish-American War, in which the United States booted Spain out of the Philippines and out of Cuba. But beyond that, 1898 had another interesting event, and here we have an important theme that comes up, and that is that the most obvious event that happens isn't always the most important. And what also happened in 1898 was it was the first meeting and the creation of the World Zionist Organization. At the following alignment of Saturn and Pluto in 1914, we have another very large sequence of events, the biggest being World War I, the Great War. The war in which hundreds of thousands of people just were marched into front lines and met bullets and bombs and were fought, and the lines barely moved, hundreds of yards over the course of years. There was just a matter of death. Also, during the alignment of 1914, we saw England sending representatives to the Arab countries requesting their support militaristically against the Ottoman Empire and to fight on the side of England. England's promise was that if you fight on our side, we will guarantee you freedom from the Turks, freedom from the Ottoman Empire after the war. And in fact, that's why after the war, countries like Iraq, Iran, Syria were created, Lebanon, with countries like England and France protecting them from the Turks. But of course, the Arabs looked at that as colonial domination also, and England met its match in Iraq. They packed up and went home, as we know, and so on. But the point here is that The World Zionist Organization was founded in 1898 under a Saturn-Pluto alignment. Under 1914, England tied itself into this by promising to defend Arab sovereignty or the homeland rule by Arabs. At the following alignment in 1931, we have the Zionists now rising against England, putting financial pressure and pressure on England. England declaring war in Palestine. Remember, it was Palestine then. It was established as an Arab state. England throws up their hands and says, we don't know what to do. Also in 1931, we have Hitler coming to power. We have Mussolini coming to power. We have Stalin coming to power. We have the Chinese being invaded by Japan. 1931 was a huge alignment of Saturn and Pluto. And actually, even though World War II doesn't fall on this particular series, just because of its enormity, I don't want to leave it out, because it falls on the halfway mark. World War II falls on a Saturn-Pluto square, a 90-degree angle, and that kind of comes to being also tied to this cycle. I should also mention that in 1931, India was rebelling against England. That was the year that Gandhi led a march to the sea in which the Indians took seawater, boiled it to make salt, as a demonstration of their freedom, because England was requiring Indians to purchase both fabric, woven textiles, and salt from England. It was a way of creating economic dependence. And Gandhi's famous Salt March, or the March to the Sea, landed him in jail that year, 1931. In 1947, at the next alignment of Saturn and Pluto, we have England granting independence to India and Pakistan. We in the West think, what a wonderful thing. There was no war fought. Gandhi, through peaceful resistance, led the Indians to throw off the shackles of colonial domination. However, in our history, we sometimes gloss over the fact, or we just forget, that 500,000 Hindus and Muslims were killed in battle skirmishes after the independence was granted, after England packed up and went home. So it wasn't all good news. Incidentally, in 1947, we also have, within a year on either side of it, we have the United Nations being founded in 1946. We have the United Nations drafting a plan that says, let's take this area called Palestine, give half of it to the Jews. Remember the Zionist movement founded in 1898 under the same alignment. Now we have the United Nations saying, let's divide this up and give half to the Jews and call it Israel, give half to the Arabs, and they can keep calling it Palestine. But by 1948, Palestine disappeared. Israel was on the map. And again, it's tied to the same ongoing battle of who is in control of Jerusalem. We then jump to the next conjunction, or the next alignment of Saturn and Pluto in 1965. This is interesting because the Mideast has heated up again. We have rebellion happening in Cyprus. We have certainly the Israel-Arab crisis now has reached a fervor point, which culminated in the 7 Days War in 1967. But we also have another interesting development, and that is the standoff that became the Cold War at the previous alignment in 1947 at the end of World War II between the United States and its allies and the communist countries behind the Iron Curtain, which went down right around the Saturn-Pluto alignment in 1947. In 1965, we have the free world, the world of capitalism, the world of the United States and the United States' allies, fighting the Soviet Union in an area that's marked off called Vietnam. It's almost as if this is the only safe way to have a war in a time of nuclear weapons, so that we fight this war in Vietnam, which was at its height during the alignment in the mid-60s. Now, we'll come back to the mid-60s in a few minutes, because the mid-60s were even more astrologically important than just this regular Saturn-Pluto alignment. The following alignment of Saturn and Pluto is in 1982. 1982 is an interesting year because, again, we have the Mideast totally topsy-turvy. 1982 saw Israel invading Lebanon. 1982 saw the Soviets tied up in an unwinnable war in Afghanistan. It was like their Vietnam. 1982 saw the only 20th century war between a colonial power in the New World, and that was the Falkland Island War, which may not register big in our historical map, but it was a war between England and Argentina, and it was a war where planes flew, bombs were dropped, people were killed. But 1982 has another interesting event. Remember, I said the most obvious thing isn't always the most important. Remember Gandhi's Salt March in 1931 at the Saturn-Pluto alignment? Remember India getting its independence in 1947 at the Saturn-Pluto conjunction? Well, in 1982, at the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, the movie Gandhi is released. You can't make it up this good. It's like there's a thread that gives times for certain expression, and these expressions seem to carry patterns on and on and on. When we look at history through the eyes of the planetary motion, through these grand divine hands on a cosmic clock, we begin to see that the terrible events of September 11th, 2001 were not isolated. They were, in fact, part of an ongoing skirmish, border wars between different points of view that have continued since the invasion of Rome, to the Crusades, to the Battle of Hastings, to the invasion of Spain by the Arabs, all the way up through now. It's part of the same ongoing battle. In fact, the only way that we'll get perspective on what happened in New York and in Washington, D.C. on September 11th, 2001 is as we look at this pattern unfold. And the next Saturn-Pluto alignment is not until 2020. And so it will take until then for us to be able to see what this does to set up what happens in 2020 and then in subsequent alignments between Saturn and Pluto. But the fact is that we can look at any two planets and look at their symbolism and see different rhythms of civilization. Saturn and Pluto are particularly interesting because they align 6 times, or actually 3 times a century, and then the halfway alignment. It's almost like a musical beat, like a waltz. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, except it's 1, 2, 3 every 100 years. 1 and 2 and 3 and. It's the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, opposition, conjunction, opposition, conjunction, opposition, and it becomes waltz time for civilization. We don't dance to it individually, but we dance to it as a collective humanity as we play out these wars and these skirmishes and these battles between ideas. But the fact is that we can look at any two planets and look at their symbolism and see different rhythms of civilization. Take the planet Uranus, for example. Uranus takes 84 years to go around the sun once. Unlike Saturn we were talking about before, which takes 30 years, Saturn is more personalized. It's the over 30, under 30 thing. It's when we reach 30 years of age, when Saturn makes one complete turn around the sun, we grow up, we become mature, we become over the hill, we become stuck. If we're over 30, we look at people under 30, and even if they're very wonderful people, they're still kids. There's something that happens around 30 about becoming of age. Now, Uranus is an 84-year cycle, and interestingly enough, if someone lives to be in their mid-80s, we say they enter a second childhood, because we get that one complete cycle of the planet Uranus. Uranus is the weird planet. Its north pole faces the sun, the moons are in the equator, everything about Uranus is weird, it's different, it's eccentric. Uranus astrologically symbolizes lightning. It symbolizes the release of built-up energy. It releases energy in a crash that can be very erratic, very upsetting, very revolutionary, but Uranus's job is to release stored up energy so that it can become freed. Incidentally, Uranus was discovered right around the time of the French Revolution and the American Revolution, a time of independence for man, and often we astrologers look at the more modern planets and we observe that the time in which they were discovered seems to correlate a little bit with their symbolism, like Pluto being discovered at the time of the rise of mass fascism in the 1930s, Neptune being discovered around the time of the rise of the steam engine, Neptune, the planet of expansion. It's a gaseous planet also. So let's come back to the planet Uranus, which takes 84 years to go around the Sun once. Let's compare its cycle to Neptune, which takes 165 years to go around the Sun once. What that means is that when Uranus has made one complete journey, 84 years, Neptune is about halfway around. So it takes 2 Uranus cycles for Uranus to catch back up to Neptune. So Uranus and Neptune align like the hands on our clock at high noon only once every 172 years. So this is a much rarer cycle than the Saturn-Pluto cycle that we were talking about earlier, which occurs approximately every 33 years in alignment, in conjunction. Uranus-Neptune occurs once every 172 years. It's occurred recently. The last Uranus alignment with Neptune was in 1993. Now, 1993, actually the period of time of 3 or 4 years around there, from the late 80s all the way through the early 90s, was a massive realignment of power structures on planet Earth. But more importantly, Uranus-Neptune seems to affect the cycle of art, of science, of technology. In 1993, the World Wide Web, give or take a couple of years, took over the planet. It's almost like, in Marshall McLuhan's words, we flipped out. Our internal nervous system became an external web, as if the brain now existed out here, and we were moving around, surfing, so to speak, inside of this larger consciousness that had been created in the early 90s. If we go back one complete Uranus-Neptune cycle, the last time that they conjoined was in 1821. Now, the early 1800s were a pretty powerful time. From a scientific or technological point of view, we had people like George Ohm, Michael Faraday, people discovering, playing with, learning how to work with electricity, theorizing what electricity was, what's magnetism, making motors and making electrical circuits. But the big question of that time was, how is electricity connected to magnetism, if at all? And at the alignment of Uranus, the planet of electricity, and Neptune, which most astrologers will correspond because of its ruling of the oceans, Neptune, the god of the oceans, it's that sense of the field, it's the sense of the diffusive. Electricity has current and it moves around according to a particular frequency. Magnetism, however, is more field-related. Uranus astrologically relates to electricity. Neptune astrologically is symbolized by magnetism. In 1821, the year that Uranus, the planet of electricity, conjoined Neptune, the planet of magnetism, Hans Christian Ørsted, in a lecture in front of a group of students, took a bar magnet and ran it over a closed circuit with a voltmeter on it, and saw that as he moved the magnet, it created electrical current. And he realized that electricity and magnetism were, in fact, part of one singular force, and the coined word was, from that period of time, electromagnetism. Electromagnetism, Uranus-Neptune alignment. And what about the halfway point, the half hour, so to speak, when Uranus and Neptune were opposed with Earth right in the middle? This was 1906, And in 1905, within a year of this alignment, we had Einstein writing and delivering the 3 papers that shook modern physics, pulled the rug out from under us, destroyed the solid ground upon which Newton had built his physics, because in the Newton perception of the world, everything was about things. It was things of substance. It was billiard balls having action against each other. Every action had an opposite and equal reaction. If we had enough mathematics, we could plot the trajectory of anything and know where it was going. Everything was cause and effect. Along comes Einstein and gives us a theory that intertwines time with space. To Newton, time was an independent variable. Space was where things happened. Einstein said, no, space is simply gravitationally warped time. Time is gravitationally warped space. The two of them are entwined. In fact, what we see as matter is light that has somehow trapped itself into holding patterns, tied itself up into knots. We, as crystalline structures, are in fact light energy that is tied gravitationally into patterns that have holding patterns that in fact respond to the larger gravitational or electromagnetic pull of the planets. This is why astrology works. You see, planets are electromagnetic vibrations. So let's come back to this Uranus-Neptune cycle, which was aligned in 1821, opposite in 1906, aligned again in 1993, and we can see how it relates to technology on some level. Look at one other cycle. Let's take a look at Uranus aligning with Pluto. Uranus aligns with Pluto approximately every 133 years. Uranus, the planet of lightning sudden change. Pluto is Latin for Hades, which is Greek for hell. Pluto is the lord of the underworld. Pluto is everything we don't understand. It's the deepest powers and desires and intensity. The last time that Uranus aligned with Pluto was in 1965. If you remember earlier, we talked about 1965 as also being a Saturn-Pluto alignment. So 1965-66 was not only Saturn aligned with Pluto, but it was Saturn aligned with Uranus and Pluto. It was a major alignment, and anyone who lived through the 60s can remember that it was a major alignment. In fact, consciousness on the planet changed during that period of time. But interestingly enough, there are correlations that aren't always the most obvious, that are sometimes the most important. In 1965, while Uranus aligned with Pluto, there was a technological leap taken. IBM announced its System 36, which was the first business computer that came complete with software. But the thing is that IBM believed that not very many of them would be sold because it felt that the main purpose of this computer was for publishing the book of capitalism, publishing digitally the information that was needed to sustain a business. However, when we have outer planet conjunctions, outer planet alignments that take place very near each other in time, they create a fabric of their own, which is what has happened because Uranus aligned with Pluto in the mid-60s, and then Uranus aligned with Neptune in the early 90s, and that's within a short enough period of time that we can remember, those of us who lived through both of these, we remember the similarity of what happened as these outer planets aligned and we had amazing awareness. That we left our normal way of thinking of things and we learned things from a spiritual dimension, from a dimension of imagination, from a dimension of technology change, from a dimension of music change, etc., etc. So let's look back in history at a time recently when Uranus-Pluto conjunction was followed in a near immediate Uranus-Neptune conjunction. The most recent example of a Uranus-Pluto conjunction followed by a Uranus-Neptune conjunction was the Uranus-Pluto conjunction of 1455, followed by the Uranus-Neptune conjunction of 1479. Now, anyone who is a history student or an art history student will recognize that period of time as the height of the Renaissance, the Florentine period of artistic flourishing. Interestingly enough, though, again, there's always something that isn't the most obvious event that becomes quite important. In 1455, the year that Uranus aligned with Pluto, a German fellow named Gutenberg mass-produced a Bible on a machine that he invented, the printing press, which he felt would only have one purpose, and that was to print the Bible. After all, what other book could be worth printing multiple copies of? You see, until then, books were printed by scribes who had to handwrite them, which meant that only someone with an enormous amount of money could afford a book, or only someone with an enormous amount of money could finance the creation of books, that is, the church, financing monks who spent their life copying religious texts, the Bible. So in 1455, and under the Uranus-Pluto conjunction, Gutenberg develops a technology that is used to print the book. But during the next couple of decades, under the financing of Cosimo Medici, under the Florentine Renaissance, we have translations being made by Marsilio Ficino, the court astrologer, incidentally, to the Medicis, who translated Plato from Greek into Latin, translated material that was snuck out of Constantinople and brought into Italy, material called the Corpus Hermetica, the secret teachings that came from some indeterminate time past, perhaps as far back as Egypt. This amazing material talked about using amulets and chants and magic for healing, and it was filled with astrology and all kinds of stuff that the church was not very happy about. However, this amazing material met the new technology, the printing press, and it was diffused all through Europe. In many ways, this fed what became the Protestant Reformation, because people began to learn that there was more perceptions than one perception of the Bible. There were more ways of looking at the universe. Interestingly enough, if we bring this up to modern times, we see the IBM System 36 coming into being under the same alignment as Gutenberg's printing press in 1455. And then just a few decades later, we see in 1993 the flourishing of computers so that everyone owned one, everyone had access to the World Wide Web, and all of a sudden it wasn't just about capitalism, it wasn't just about a particular political point of view. Information was flowing all around the planet, and it was out of control from those people who thought they needed to control it. Just like the printing press, by 1479, the Uranus-Neptune conjunction, then the church lost control because information was being printed on the printing press. So again, we see the repeating patterns of history as we look at them through the rising and falling of planetary tides, that instead of rising and falling twice a day like the lunar tides, the tides of the ocean, these tides rise and fall over decades or over centuries. And when we begin to look at history through this filter, we begin to appreciate that single events do not happen by themselves. They always happen in a fabric of continuity connected to larger events of the past, to unknown events of the future, and that through astrology we get a different perception of history. There's really no way that we could overstate the enormity of the paradigm shift that we just are beginning to put our toes into the tip of. We talk as if it's happened. We talk as if the paradigm shift is here. You hear that talk over and over again in scientific circles, in New Age circles, in religious circles, in spiritual circles. But the fact of the matter is that the enormity of the Saturn-Pluto alignment on September 11th, 2001, coupled with its near proximity to the Uranus-Neptune alignment in 1993, coupled to its proximity to the Uranus-Pluto alignment in the mid-60s with Saturn there also, it's going to take years, maybe decades, maybe even centuries in order to grow into what this particular shift is really all about. The fact of the matter is that we have already begun to change in the universe that we live in. We used to live in a universe that was apparently real. The Stargate that we've slipped through the latter part of the 20th century, in fact, has moved us into a wider realm of electromagnetic frequencies that are infra and ultra to our previous sensory mechanisms. We are very comfortable these days in moving about in altered time-space dimensions. My role as an astrologer is an age-old, honored role, and that is that my job is that of a magician. The Magi, the Zoroastrian priests who found their way to the birth of Jesus, were in fact Magi, wise men. They were astrologers. They were studying the sky at night to understand how divine intervention manifested here on earth. My job as an astrologer is to, like the Magi, to do magic. But the magic that I do, the magic that we astrologers do, is not the cheap stage tricks of making lions and tigers or cards disappear or appear in the air. Our magic is more subtle and maybe more powerful. Our magic is bending space and time. What we are doing by this little astrological journey of our individual minds is taking a trip into an altered state of reality where time becomes something different than it normally is. We'll return to our normal lives and go about doing what we normally do. However, our perception will have been altered. And that's the role of the astrologer, that's the role of astrology, is to give us a framework based upon the movement of the planets so that we can see the mundane world through a different set of eyes, that once and for all can help us on a path that moves us into a new way of perceiving things. We have, in fact, moved through the Stargate. We are in a different world, but we are not arrived yet. We, in some ways, are like the children of Israel wandering around in the desert, waiting for the old ways to die off before we can really move into whatever it is that's next. We may not be the ones that actually even move there, but our children and our children's children will. It's our generations, however, that have dipped our toes into quantum pond. But the thing about ripples in a quantum pond is that we do not know the effects that they will have. Astrology is not a simple cause and effect relationship. That was the astrology of the Newton Empire. 200 or 300 years ago, astrologers believed in fate. Fate is like the particle side of the particle wave duality. We now know that planets are not just particles, they're particles and waves. Particle, fate, waves, free will. So as we dip our toes into quantum pond and watch these ripples move out, astrology, more than anything else, reminds us that our future is not sealed in fate. In fact, it's sealed in every little action that we take every time we poke into that quantum pond. Every action we take has ripples, and those ripples have ramifications that build and come back